All right, there we go. Well, welcome back, everybody. We are in webinar number 4, Serving Unhoused and Housing Insecure Families. And we're going to just go straight into the presentation because there is a lot to share. And I want to ensure that we have some time for Q&A and some sharing and discussion at the end as well. But just to start, I want to share that when we're talking about living situations and people's unique needs and experiences, it can feel very sensitive. I just want to honor that and recognize that and acknowledge that, particularly because homelessness is framed as a personal failure or a moral failure rather than what it really is, which is a systemic failure within our society. So please be assured that everything shared in this discussion is done with a great deal of compassion and a lot of compassion and honor for families who are going through these situations. And the way that I'm going to be teaching today is from an explicitly anti-colonial social justice framework. And we're going to really position homelessness and housing insecurity as a public health emergency and as a cultural imperative for tribal communities in Michigan and beyond. So, with regards to homelessness in Indian country, I really believe, and I'm sure you all do too, that no one should be homeless on sovereign lands. And therefore, tribes must take a stronger stance to end homelessness and assure safe and affordable housing as a human right for all members in our communities. So this all is not at all whatsoever a judgment on families and the circumstances that they face. We have talked so much at length already about the stigmatization of families who experience or are at risk for substance use disorders and families in recovery, the challenges, the limitations, the opportunities, the strengths of the families going through that, as well as the resources and opportunities and limitations in accessible resources to families. And those who are experiencing housing insecurity have many, many layers of oppression that they're facing. So, all that is to say that I hope you can feel that compassion and that justice framework coming through in our teachings today. So, to start out, we're going to go through some definitions and examples of what unhoused or homelessness can look like and what is the difference between them. There are federal definitions, like through the Housing and Urban Development, and you can go and look those up if you wanted to. But essentially, the federal government says that anyone who doesn't have a permanent address, a permanent home address, is considered to be homeless. There are some discussion, and I wouldn't say debate, but more informed discussion within social justice communities around the words homeless versus unhoused. Housing insecure is more for families who aren't yet homeless or unhoused, but whose homes could be taken away or disappear at any moment. Like, um, their housing just isn't something that is stable from month to month. Um, some people do not like the word homeless because it feels more stigmatizing, or it feels like there's a very certain stereotype of what homelessness is. However, there are forms of homelessness where there are shelters involved. So it's just delineating that there are many types of homelessness and that someone can still be housed, but technically be homeless. So I don't really have strong opinions on either of those. If you do, just I ask you to just roll with the discussion and maybe you can bring forward your expertise and experience as well. But I'm going to try to speak of homelessness generically, but also be specific about the types of homelessness that a family can experience. Because typically, when we say that, what do we conjure up in our minds? If we were to even just go to Google and open it up and type in homeless families, we would see people living on the streets, or we would see people living in an encampment. And that is a reality for many people, but there are lots of types of homelessness, many of which are we're going to see with the families that we work with, including living in your car, living in an abandoned building, staying at a homeless shelter. Technically, living in a tent or a camper or other temporary shelter is a form of homelessness, even if someone is camped out in an actual authorized campground or like a campsite. Transient housing, which is just for people who are sort of in services, like in between living situations, where it may be like a single family space, but it is typically going to be a one room hotel or motel room. In a lot of our communities, that's what transient housing is going to look like. And then doubling up or couch surfing. So we'll go through some examples of what those are and some of the challenges of those living arrangements, some of the impacts that we can have on health and family development, especially in the perinatal period. So, doubling up or couch surfing, this is when someone is living with a friend or a family member or with other even strangers, people that aren't part of the friend and family network of somebody, or couch surfing, meaning you don't have a permanent address of your own, but you're just going from house to house with whoever it is that will allow you to stay there. This is an interesting one because if we go back into our history as an Anishinaabe, a lot of us are aware that living communally is a cultural practice that is historically relevant and that is traditional for a lot of Indigenous people. This form of doubling up or this sort of like intergenerational living is still somewhat common in a lot of our communities. However, it is distinguished from intergenerational living intentionally because doubling up comes with its challenges and limitations. For instance, and we see this all the time, one disagreement or, just a difference in the needs and limitations for a particular family can end up in someone getting kicked out and being homeless again. There's less access for the homeless family who is doubling up with somebody to build their credit or to have other wealth building strategies. And overall, we just have much more systemic issues, structural issues that make communal living less sustainable than when we lived communally in wigwams or in lodges and teepees for our historical communities. So I do see this a lot with the families that I serve. It does always feel somewhat tenuous. Families can definitely feel like they don't have their privacy, they don't have their space. There could be very different schedules that families are living on, different needs for transportation, for getting kids to school, and so forth. This was also um, the type of homelessness that I experienced as a youth, and I haven't really spoken much to my, stories and experiences during this series because I wanted to keep it to the cultural pieces and serving families. But although there's a roof over your head, it can disappear at any time. And that's definitely what I felt like when I was going through this as a teenager. I was actually homeless from the age of 14 to the age of 19. And I was literally just couch surfing wherever I could go. And I would have my little bag with the very few things that I was able to save from my childhood home when my mom passed away very suddenly and very unexpectedly. So, doubling up is a form of being sheltered, but it is also a form of homelessness, and it can be very unstable. Living in a tent in a camper. This is one that I did want to mention because a lot of us are here in Michigan. Some of you are in the Great Lakes region or surrounding area, or you may be aware of the challenges that we have in our environment because temporary shelters are not protective against the weather. In harsh weather conditions, they just aren't going to be sturdy. They're not stable. Um, and I have seen it firsthand where families are staying in campers or staying in tents, and their shelters get destroyed by the weather, especially for us here in the UP with the winters that we have and the conditions that we can face. So they aren't protective. Um, but I think it is worth noting that there are a lot of disparities within our dominant society around the acceptability of RV living and the fact that there are uh, ways to present RV living as being innovative, um, upscaling campers. There's whole influencers who make a ton of money just driving around and living in different campgrounds, renovating campers or living in tiny homes. And so while we as a society glorify that and monetize that when it comes to families who are unsheltered, who don't have a home to return to, whose existence isn't monetized and rewarded by society, they're actually more stigmatized and looked down upon. And it is really an issue of classism. So people who are choosing to live in renovated upscale campers or tiny homes are like thought to be creative and smart with their money. They're saving money, they're downsizing, they're doing things the right way. The perception or conception of unhoused individuals who have to live in RVs or tents are more are much more negative, right? Of a negative stereotype. And despite the cost effectiveness and scalability of safe and stable tiny homes, it isn't something that a lot of our communities have really adopted in terms of accepting or creating and building spaces for tiny homes for unhoused individuals to have safe and stable housing. So just a lot of disparities and a lot of cultural things that we can see coming up when we talk about living in a camper or living in an RV. Let's see what else I wanted to say about that. Small hotel rooms, transient housing, or transitional housing. Again, at least it is a roof over your head, and it's like an accessible toilet that you can use with a sink and a shower. But they aren't really suitable for long-term living. And there are a lot of challenges that can be faced that I have seen and worked with families who are in transitional housing that we're going to talk about later when we talk about impacts on the family. But they're just like the room that I'm sitting in right now to teach in, and then with the expectation that now you will raise a child and you will heal from your birth and you'll somehow we're as public health educators asking you to read to your children and eat traditional foods and do all the right things, but the space that you're in makes it really, really difficult to do that. And so we're going to talk about what are some of those difficulties that families can face and what are some of the workarounds that they might be able to access. And wanted to share um, just a vision or a picture of who actually becomes homeless in our country and in our state and within our tribal communities. So, starting at large and then working our way down into the local context. Since 2020, the rates of homelessness nationally have increased. There are very few states and communities where homelessness has actually decreased, and we have a lot of populations in our country where homelessness has dramatically increased. A lot of that has to do with just the socioeconomic status and the economic environment that we're all living in, including the recession, the inflation, the extraordinarily high and skyrocketing housing costs, as well as the cost of living virtually everywhere in the country. But specifically after 2020, there were, moratoriums and rent freezes that basically ended once COVID was over. So all of those COVID era protections that were actually preventing homelessness for a lot of families, once they were done, then those families became unhoused. So nationally, there is still a crisis of homelessness. In Michigan, specifically in 2023, 2023, this is the last year that we could find the numbers. I'm sure 2024 would be available soon. There were over 30,000 homeless people in Michigan, and our homeless population accounts for about 1% of the country's total. So it's a lot of people here in Michigan. And if we think about just the sheer difficulty of the Four Seasons environment that we live in, you can see how that could be a crisis in and of itself. Homelessness has steadily been on the rise. A lot of community supports have been discontinued since COVID era protections have ended. And who is most at risk for becoming homeless? I was recently watching a webinar. It's from the Build Collective, which focuses on early childhood development and supporting families of children 0 to 3. And they, like, the number one thing that stuck out to me from that webinar was nationally, this is the statistic, the population that is most at risk for being evicted from their living situation are children and infants ages 0 to 2. So children and infants ages 0 to 2 are the most likely demographic to be evicted from their living situation. So the highest numbers of homelessness tend to be adults with young children. And in Michigan, homelessness among youth ages 18 to 24 is increasing, whereas homelessness among other populations has decreased or stayed the same. With the caveat that in Michigan, the UP is the region with the largest increase in homelessness since 2020. The biggest risk factor for becoming homeless is having previously been homeless. So it is extremely hard cycle to get out of, and there tends to be a lot of repetitiveness in who is accessing homelessness services in the state of Michigan. And I was thinking about my experience as a doula working mainly for Native American and Indigenous families, and what are some of the key characteristics that I have noticed about housing insecurity and homelessness, and who becomes unhoused and who's at risk for it in our communities among the families that I've worked with or been aware of. And it is by far, in a way, women and children who are escaping domestic violence. So there's a really immense problem in our communities, and it really impacts pregnant and postpartum women. And I think a lot of you are probably very aware of the MMIW movement and a lot of the efforts and advocacy to raise awareness. A lot of you may also be aware that a huge proportion of MMIW cases are actually women who are pregnant and or who have given birth within the year of their disappearance or within a year of their death. So it does contribute to the maternal mortality statistics in our state and in our country. There's a lot of things to know about why is domestic violence linked to homelessness. And a lot of different things are happening. One, it's just, the sheer need for somebody to escape interpersonal violence or to escape a home that has been made to be unsafe. There is this, I don't know what else to what else to call it, but we call it baby trapping. And I think everyone knows what I mean when I say that. It is the act of coercing or encouraging or even forcing a pregnancy on someone in order to then trap them in the relationship so that there is this additional link to them that can never be severed. And we do see this often in our community. There is also financial abuse and control. It can be very difficult for women who are attempting to flee from interpersonal violence or to seek their own living arrangements in instances where there's financial abuse and control, meaning they haven't any credit of their own. They don't have bills in their own name. I've seen it where perpetrators of domestic violence have racked up debt and destroyed the credit of their partner in order to maintain more control dynamics over them. So there's just so many complications for families to escape domestic violence and the ways that that is actually linked to homelessness. Furthermore, perpetrators of domestic violence make spaces literally unsafe and unlivable by doing things like cutting off the electricity, like literally going outside and cutting the cords so that electricity doesn't reach the house. Just doing whatever they can to maintain power and control over someone who is being victimized by domestic violence. So it is a really difficult situation to escape from. And there are just lots of confounding factors that can make it additionally difficult for someone to access housing if there's even housing in the community. And I've noticed also that a lot of people who are at risk for being unhoused or for experiencing housing insecurity in the perinatal period that I've noticed are young families who are moving away from home to seek their own living situation. So it may not necessarily be that they are fleeing an unsafe situation. It's just that they want to be able to have their own space. They are starting their family. They want to be in their own, private living situation. And that I've noticed is a really unstable time for a lot of really young families. So some of the structural issues and social issues that contribute to homelessness for those who are at those higher risks, like we talked about. Of course, the housing market, everyone is aware about the cost of living and how that is increased across the board. Um, Housing instability, lack of affordable housing with stagnated wages, economic inequality, and inflation. I did read that over 40% of Michigan households struggle to maintain their monthly expenses. So that's almost half of Michigan households. As we all know, tribal housing wait lists can be very long. It can take someone years to get into tribal housing, and there's such a limited amount of actual houses that are available to tribal members. And it can be even more complicated when there's tribal members who are from different nations from around the state or from around the country, who don't get priority. And just the way that it works out, sometimes someone can be on the list for a really, really long time waiting for a house. There are a lot of other social factors. The the state of Michigan has several cities that have some of the highest housing costs in the country. A lot of you can probably guess what some of those cities are: Grand Rapids, Ann Arbor, and Detroit. And of course, all of you know those are service areas for urban Indian organizations as well as many of our Michigan tribes. So there is also this racial inequity in homelessness because in the state of Michigan, uh, people of color are basically at a much higher risk of becoming unhoused than their white counterparts. It is illegal to make a shelter in many places. So there are a lot of anti-homeless architecture and laws, and we're seeing these popping up all over the place. We're definitely experiencing and witnessing um, what they're calling sweeps of homeless encampments. So, tent cities or homeless encampments where they come in and just literally kick everyone out and demolish the structures. We can't park cars for overnight stays in a lot of places. And, it actually is very expensive and it is actually illegal to be engaging in a lot of these forms of unhoused or homelessness in our state. So it is a really difficult space to be in. I thought it was worth noting that the leading cause of mortality for people who experience homelessness in Michigan within the year of their death is drug overdose. And it made me think back to the very first Narcan and naloxone training that I did, which was probably at this point like 6 or 7 years ago, when when we all learn when we take those trainings who is at the highest risk of overdose deaths. It's people who haven't used in a while. So, someone who has had a period of sobriety or recovery, and we know the chemical reasons why they are at higher risk. So, if we think about the movement of transient families, as well as the just layers and layers of social risk and oppression that they face, then it isn't surprising, perhaps, to most of you that the leading cause of mortality for people who experience homelessness is drug overdose. And it can also just be really challenging to seek services for something that's sort of extraneous to being unhoused, because that is a basic need that isn't being met. Everything else is really easy for it to sort of fall to the wayside. And so the experience of being unhoused, and this is one of the like catchphrases from the Build organization when they were doing this webinar on homelessness. They said there's no place to grow. So like I said, we're all really invested in perinatal outcomes, and we want to reverse the tide of health disparities in our communities, and we do the work because it's hard work and we really care about people, even though they're facing a lot of difficulties and a lot of challenges. And so much of the work that we do um, doesn't really resonate to somebody experiencing homelessness, because that huge unmet need really overshadows all the other things that we really care about and really want to support someone on. What do you like? Who's going to be reading to their child, however many minutes a day, um, when they're in and out of a campsite, or their encampment is being demolished, or, they're living in a car? Like that just isn't something that they're going to be able to access. So the experience is extraordinarily stressful. Stress, as we know, is a public health risk factor. It is something that does impact the healing of a postpartum person. It does impact the accessibility of breast milk flowing in our community. And it also is just a period of time when families are experiencing a lot of stigmatization from society, from outsiders looking in, thinking that they just didn't do enough. Um, they didn't try hard enough to not become homeless. They just didn't do all the right things, and that's what happened to them, or they made bad decisions. So there can be a lot of guilt and a lot of shame, particularly when there's children involved, because now there's these additional lives to care for. And families really want to do right by their children, and it can be really hard to feel like you're doing the right thing when you're experiencing housing instability or transitional experiences. Navigating services is really complex and really time consuming. It is almost like a full time job in and of itself to be someone who is unhoused, and to make all the calls and to put out all the applications to be approved by various very disconnected types of services. And it can be very limited to really specific demographics of people, and it can be really complex to know what kinds of services you are actually eligible for and which ones you're not. It can be really difficult when you have a family who has intergenerational living. It can be really challenging if there's like mixed genders in some living situations. Men and women cannot live together. And so you may have a dad who's actually separated from their family and placed in a completely different living situation than the mother of their child and their children. As you know, in a lot of unhoused situations and shelters included, there's no pets allowed. And this actually is a huge barrier for a lot of families because they don't want to give up their pets. Some people would actually rather live in their cars than to see their pets go somewhere else or to relinquish them. It can be really challenging if you see your pets as like they are part of the family. And so there are risks for health complications and mortality. Importantly, we need to remember that the postpartum healing that we talked about and the newborn care and development doesn't just pause because someone's experiencing something as difficult as being unhoused. Like you're still bleeding, you're still leaking, your uterus is still healing. Babies are still needing that external nervous system and that external womb that we talked about, the warmth and the temperature regulation, the blood sugar regulation, the heart rate regulation, the ability to develop and work within the reflexes that they're born with. As you can imagine, all of that can just become really complicated and really difficult and challenging when you're in situations where you don't just have the freedom and the privilege to heal and exist as a family when you're navigating all of these additional issues. Can definitely lead to decreased parent confidence as well. And homelessness is, of course, linked to a decrease in family well-being, even in delayed infant development or interruptions in infant development, as well as success in reaching milestones for school-age children, with absenteeism being one of the number one outcomes of a school-aged youth who is experiencing homelessness. So lots and lots of things can influence the experience of being homeless. Other confounding factors, it's worth talking about homeless shelters because a lot of times in our bigger cities, this can be something that someone can access basically only on an emergency basis. Of course, these aren't long-term stays that they're eligible for. But sometimes, we prop this up as like one of the community-based solutions to homelessness, but it is worth um, listening to people who have lived in homeless shelters and listening to their experiences. And I've worked with many families who've been in shelters. There are a lot of rules and a lot of limitations that can make living there extraordinarily difficult. Many shelters will have a religious influence that doesn't resonate with traditional Indigenous people or culturally rooted Indigenous people. There are a lot of limitations, just such as, they typically serve only certain foods every day. You are not allowed to take food into your room. You can't bring food into the facility. You cannot use the microwave after certain hours. There's often a curfew, and if you miss the curfew, then you can get kicked out of the shelter. There can be limitations on how many members of the family can live in a space, as well as age restrictions and gender based restrictions. And there can be a lot of just like shaping of the experience that people who've lived in shelters have said it feels very similar to being in jail, but then you still have to care for your children and do all the things. Someone is telling you what to do basically every hour of the day. And there are a lot of limitations as to like the freedoms that you have in that space and how you can care for your family and the different needs that somebody might have. I think about my own children. 2 out of 3 of my children are neurodiverse, and just how extraordinarily difficult daily living can be in my own home. And I'm like, man, I couldn't imagine, having an ADHD child or an autistic child in a space like that, or living in encampment, or being doubled up with somebody who doesn't understand or who has a different way of living than I do. How difficult it might be when you add in those additional factors for children's mental health as well as children with special medical needs. Hmm. All right. So we get into some family-centered solutions and some things that I've learned in working with people who are experiencing homelessness, as well as listening to them. And I did get some input from some of the families that I've worked with for this presentation as well, just to see what are some of the what I would call them life hacks. And I'm always thinking about, okay, how do I make it work for the environment that somebody's in, whether I'm working with them in the hospital, whether I'm working with families who are in a shelter, whether I'm working with families who are doubled up or couch surfing, whatever that situation is. I work with families in, single hotel rooms with no cooktop, no sink, nothing, like just a little tiny room with a bathroom, and that's it. So lots of different types of living situations. We'll talk about what are some of the solutions for families. This would be of particular interest to those of you who are birth workers and who actually do direct service with families in their home. So we have to know what our local resources are. We really want to be aware of what are the services that we can refer people to if they're not already aware. It would be very good for us to have met our local DV resource center, meet the staff there. Um, if not, go there to actually tour the facilities and see what it's like, and to just get a walkthrough of what it's like when you come in the door. What is it that you're going to get? What do you need to bring with you? What are the limitations of those facilities? Because you're going to get referral pathways. It's really good for us to have um, relationships with our family support workers and our advocates at the DV resource centers, as well as the shelters, so that they can call on us when there's women in need of our services. When it comes to housing instability and economic instability and all of the various, oppressive factors that our families are experiencing, breastfeeding really is a life-saving option, and it can be the sometimes the only safe or accessible option. So breastfeeding really is a lifeline for families who are experiencing homelessness, and for lots of reasons. The same reason that homelessness impacts, the ability to like wash your hands and have fresh and clean period products. Like, there's not much ability to prepare bottles of formula or even donated milk in some of these situations, or some of these unhoused or homeless situations. And I've actually seen it where families in hotel rooms didn't have a sink for washing things. Like, they just couldn't wash dishes. So, let alone sterilizing formula and preparing it the way that it is supposed to be prepared. So, breastfeeding support really is a lifeline. It is a life saving, critical support for families. So, we really want to be able to surround families with proper breastfeeding education and to continue breastfeeding duration through the duration of experiencing housing instability. Because we can also be facing, unfiltered water, or um, water that is lead contaminated in some of our communities. Uh, this is something that comes up a lot, and I know that's of interest to a lot of you, because in our tribal communities, we've done so much work around consistent safe sleep education. We have to be really consistent with our messaging, but also be really equitable with the way that we share education around bed sharing. It has to be very tailored to families and the situation that they're in. And the safety of that parent and their infant is like, it really is one of the key pieces to their safety and well-being. So we want to have consistent messaging that is easy to understand for the client, as well as equitable bed sharing information. What isn't helpful are some of these sort of global or universal campaigns that we often have, or that we often see, and that reach people saying, you can't do this, you can't do that, that isn't really helpful to someone experiencing homelessness. If their option is bed sharing or sleeping a baby in a car seat, because there's no crib in a homeless shelter, or they're living, doubled up with somebody else, then consistent and safe bed sharing education is the safe education that they need, because car seat sleeping isn't safe for the baby. They may think it is because we've so highly stigmatized bed sharing with children that they may think it's actually better to keep them over there. So we just want to be really clear and really consistent in the messaging, but also tailoring it to what it is that that particular family needs. And that may mean we have to like take a breath and be okay with providing safe bed sharing information, because that could be the actual life saving situation for a lot of people. And then getting into nourishment. Wanted to spend some time on this because I know a lot of you do a lot of work with traditional foods and with food sovereignty, and those of you who are doulas, there's a big emphasis on providing nourishment and nutrition to families in different types of settings. So I did come up with some of the ways that I've worked with families in different types of settings, as well as getting some input from people who have been in homeless shelters specifically. Sorry about the Coast Guard helicopter right outside my window. And what do you do? Like, how do you actually provide nourishment to your families within the constrictions of the living situation? And we'll start with shelters because that's what we've been talking a lot about. What do you do if you're in a shelter? We really still care about your healing. We want you to have the best food, the culturally rooted food that your family are used to. But there can be a lot of rules and restrictions and limitations on what you can do in a shelter. Typically, you're not going to be able to bring your own food in. You're not even allowed to bring food or snacks into your room. They can only be eaten in the kitchen. The kitchen is going to typically be closed at nighttime. So you have a nighttime snacker, or you're a breastfeeding mom and you're up in the middle of the night and you're really hungry, you might have to have some workarounds for how to make that work. One of the ways that we can do that is with um, having food delivered. So we don't want to give up our meal trains just because a family is experiencing unhoused or homelessness. We do a lot in our doula trainings around how to coordinate a meal train and what that actually looks like step by step. But getting food delivered from community members in your meal train that is stored in smaller portion sizes, because sometimes you will have access to a pretty small fridge or something with a lid, versus bringing like a huge pan of casserole or a big pot of soup, because then once they've eaten their meal, there's no way to store the leftovers and they're left with this big thing now that they have to wash. So portioning things out into smaller size portions that are able to be stored, cold deli sandwiches or wraps, or samosas or anything like handheld like that that can be put in a sack lunch, can be really supportive to families in shelter situation. Fruits and vegetables that are already washed and cut up and put into small cups with lids or resealable plastic bags, because it's just not as much access to the kitchen to be able to wash fresh fruits and veggies and to be able to cut them into the appropriate size for choking prevention for babies and young children. Anything that can be put in a bag that can be saved for later. Shelf-stable baked goods, snack packs, cups of noodles and ramen, canned tuna and chicken, dried seaweed, nuts and fruit. And then don't forget about the spices and the seasoning. So portioning out table spices and condiments to spice up the food. This was a suggestion from somebody that I had asked for some input on this presentation, because she said the food that they served at the shelter didn't have any flavor, and so they really appreciated when someone actually brought them some condiments and some table spices that they could flavor their own food. And then she also mentioned that drink mix packets and instant coffee and creamer, the powdered kind, were helpful because then they could serve themselves with different types of drinks. And that is some extra nourishment that you can access as well. And then our mutual aid fundraising, DoorDash gift cards, anything that a family could be able to access so that they can go and get takeout and do their own meal delivery is something that families could definitely appreciate. And then what if you're working with somebody who um, was in a hotel room or some of the other transitional housing, or even doubled up in a space where there's just no cooktop or maybe only just a microwave or a hot plate? And I have seen this. I've walked into homes where there's no cooktop, or there's just there's no access to the kitchen, or what they have is like basically a microwave. I've also worked with families where the hotel rooms they're in are a single room with no kitchenette, meaning no kitchen sink, no stovetop, no, like, maybe a microwave and a very, very small fridge, like a mini fridge. And so some of the ways that I've worked around that or worked with them is, and a lot of this is like, it's community mutual aid, right? It's that we care about your well-being, and so this is what we provide. Everything doesn't have to be like a billable service. So we've done fundraising to support families, and we've gotten donations, but I've gotten donations of slow cookers. So having a slow cooker with an extension cord, really important, because most of these spaces aren't going to have like a spot to put cooking implements where a cord can reach. So you're definitely going to want to bring an extension cord, as well as those plastic bag cookers that go inside a slow cooker. That way, when it's done, all they have to do is tie it up and throw it away rather than having to rinse it all out. Working with a rice cooker, same thing, a rice cooker with a extension cord. Rice being a cultural food to a lot of different communities. Using the hot plate to heat up tortillas and naan breads, using it essentially as a warmer for any kind of food. Even tamales, you could keep in the husk, and just flip them over after a couple of minutes on the hot plate. And then having access to small um, pots and pans. Using steamer bags of veggies, pastas, and rice, if they do have access to a microwave, can be really supportive. It can actually make a whole meal just in the steamer bags. Um, and then thinking about the ways of feeding a baby aside from breastfeeding directly from the breast. There are steamer bags that can be used in the microwave for washing bottles. So if someone did not have the ability to sterilize bottles in between because they can cook them on a stovetop, then the microwave could be your next best option. And then how do you wash dishes if there's no sink? Aside from the steamer bags, what we have done with some situations is just getting a square Tupperware bin, like a washing up bin, and getting two or three of those. Kind of like when we're out at ceremony, we have to wash the dishes and there's no sink, right? So one is the soap, and that's where like you're doing the majority of the rinsing. There's a second one with soap, so you're washing it again, and then there's third one with just water. And getting two or three of those donated to somebody can really make a difference that they can actually wash their dishes in real time. And then just a stand or a towel to put them on, as well as having sponges and smaller bottles of dish soap for them to be able to use. Something that a lot, like every family I've ever worked with has said, they always need extra large garbage bags because garbage bags in these motel rooms are really small, and house cleaning isn't coming in on a daily basis to clean the space and to change the garbages. And if you have a whole family and you're cooking meals and you have baby diapers and you're doing all the things, your garbage is going to get filled up very quickly. So having extra, like real large size garbage bags can be really supportive, as well as paper plates and plastic utensils. So sometimes the workarounds are, different than the way we might do feasting in our community. Um, might be relying a lot upon disposable things because there just isn't as much availability to be able to wash and reuse stuff. But I have had families that said if they had like one set, like a feast bundle for each family member, that would have been, that would have made a really big difference for them. Less dishes to wash and more of a feel like you're eating a real meal on actual plates. And then a donation or rental of a small handheld vacuum for cleaning up crumbs. Because again, we're making messes. We just want to be creative about how we can be cleaning those up in such a small space, especially in spaces where sometimes it's not as much access to housekeepers who are coming in and cleaning it up. Just having that handheld vacuum can be really supportive. So that was a lot about nourishment and how to get food in those various types of living situations. And so homelessness is preventable. It is a community and cultural imperative. Tribal communities should really be thinking about the number of families that are homeless in our communities, how it really shouldn't be accepted as a reality for a lot of our families in our tribal communities. And we should be thinking every day, what can we do to prevent this? How can we leverage our power, privilege, and position as professionals who work here to reduce and prevent homelessness in Indian country? And so I wanted to point out that, in the state of Michigan, there are a number of federally funded immigrant detention centers that are being rapidly erected all over our state against the consent of the taxpayers of these communities. Michigan hasn't invested hardly any money or efforts into preventing and treating homelessness at a structural level. The vast majority of work that's being done in the state of Michigan is directed at assisting individuals to connecting to services. So it is again this individualized stigmatization that, like, if you just call all the right numbers and fill out all the right forms, then you won't be homeless anymore. If you just do all the right things, do them in the right order and in the right timeline, then you can get out of this situation. Rather than addressing the root causes of homelessness through housing initiatives, universal basic income, eviction moratoriums, and rent freezes, which were achieved during COVID. So we know they can be done. Michigan has focused all of its economic relief through tax credit efforts aimed at developers and shareholders of basically huge corporate housing conglomerations. And so they get tax credits that make the shareholders happy. But these initiatives have actually led to the housing of less than 900 individuals since 2020. So it's a huge amount of tax initiatives being aimed at developers that really haven't led to any sort of structural improvements for Michigan families. There's still 30,000 other homeless individuals who haven't been reached by this. So there's a lot of limitations as to how someone can get out of homelessness, as well as just so many social and structural and systemic oppressions that families are facing. And then when you layer in the additional complications of experiencing substance use disorders or being in recovery and the risks for overdose that happen in that very vulnerable time period, you can see just how big of an emergency this really is for our people. And so to close us out, as always, I'm going to invite those of you who are watching the recording to, just write this out in your notes or talk with somebody in your space or voice memo yourself. What are some of your thoughts about this question? What are some of the community and cultural solutions that you can think of? And for those of you who are here live in the presentation, We'll stop the recording there so that we can go into our community discussion.